welcome everyone on this wet, grey, London-like day. I'm just back from London, so New York has presented a London weather for me, which I'm grateful for. But we are here to talk about something which is not rainy, and it's a spy thriller. It's a novel set in 3 different locations, and I'll get to that in a second. It's my great pleasure to be with my friend Joanne, who did what I used to do, which was chairing the Writers in Prison Committee at Penn International, but a little before my time. Joanne has written 4 novels, has contributed to anthologies, and have written a great work of non-fiction to which I'll come to at the end. I'm Salil Tripathi. I was born in Bombay, lived in London, Singapore, now in New York, and the Rolling Stone that doesn't gather moss. And I write non-fiction mainly, but have been a foreign correspondent, so the stories that she writes about here are very close to the bone, and I'm going to come to that because this novel, The Far Side of the Desert, does several things. It has 3 stories within one. One is, of course, espionage. There is, of course, a lot of stories about spies and about people who work in the cloak and dagger manner. There's a lot of literature. It is, of course, a fast-paced thriller, but there are very moving passages and very moving works of writing which take us to deeper and into the emotions and elevate it to a higher plane than just a racy bestseller. It takes us to Santiago de Compostela. It begins there. It talks about the people who are there, in a mass amount of people disappearing, people being kidnapped, people being abducted. You don't know who's taking whom and where and when and how. People trusting strangers and going with them for a dance and not knowing whether they will come back. Slight bit of anxiety there too. There is that. And then it shifts to the aridity of a desert, where you have no idea where you are. And it's in every sense of the term, because there's vast amounts of sand. There are no boundaries. The boundaries, if they're ever drawn, are drawn by colonial masters. And you don't know where they are and where one country ends and another begins, and whether they're even countries or are they mere expressions of geography. That's what happened. And you don't know where you are. And then the buzz of the Washington Party, which is very exciting, and I have some questions about that too. And a lot of high finance and weapons. And these are the themes that keep coming even in Burning Distance and other works that she has written. And there is crime. There is a brutality of sexual assault, which shows that there's nothing attractive or affectionate about it, and also the growth of affection, maybe love, we don't yet know, towards the end of the novel, and in another case. So, my first question to you, Joanne, is this a Washington novel? Is it a novel about the becoming of Europe? Because you do go back to Cordoba and the history of Spain in one level, or is it about the borderlessness of desert, finance, or is it bits of everything?
And you forgot the Greek mythology.
Of course. Hercules and the pillars. There are pillars of Hercules there, yes. And Gibraltar here and Ceuta and Melilla on the other side, indeed.
I like to say it's a novel. I have an odd writing and publishing history because I've been writing for decades, but it took a long time for these books to come out. And one of the reasons it took so long is the publishers would say, she's a really good writer, we like it, but what is it? Is it a thriller? Is it a love story? Is it a family story? We don't know how to publish it. And I said, it's a novel. So fortunately, my agent found a publisher that publishes international political thrillers. And I am very happy if I am now an international political thriller writer. But that is not ever what I set out to do. So now I'm reading those because I hadn't read a lot of those. But whatever gets the book into readers' hands is fine. And the book, as you know, or certainly any novelist knows, evolves over time. So you set out not necessarily knowing, a few novelists do, but the majority that I know don't necessarily know the beginning, middle, and end. They sometimes know the beginning and the end, but it's the vast middle that is the discovery. And I was that way. I was in Santiago de Compostela. The first time was for an International Pen Congress in the
We want to save that story to the end.
Okay, I'll save that story till the end. And I have been in every location in this book. One other interesting thing to me is in this book, when I was writing about this story in the desert, it was so long ago, nobody was looking at what was happening in the Sahara. Nobody was thinking of terrorists or ISIS or Al Qaeda or anything. And I'm writing thinking, why am I writing about this? I keep doing more research. say, yeah, no, this is real. And then it suddenly becomes headlines. And in my novel Burning Distance, which just came out in paperback, was published last year, that novel, had it been published when I first wrote it, it would have been very prescient. It was even before 9/11. And I was writing about the components of the weapons of mass destruction and how the West had sold so many of those. It took so long to get published that it is now historical fiction. I mean, seriously. So what that does is that makes me and any novelist realize that you are not really anymore a journalist. You have to find out what is the story that can go the distance, and it really is the story of characters. And over time, as I've written, I've realized, without being conscious of it at first, that I really wrote with 3 circles of narrative. And the outside circle is sort of the world, the journalist world. I was interested in what had happened to the components of mass destruction. I was interested in what was happening with arms trafficking, drug trafficking, people trafficking, this criminal membrane that is really wrapped around terrorism and just stifles so many societies because of it. And the journalist in me was doing lots and lots of research. And some of it was before the internet, so I have notebooks after notebooks of, clippings, newspaper clippings. And that was the journalist writing, but it's not a novel. The second circle is the community within, the family, the community they live in. And the middle circle, the most important, are the main characters. And as I made the transition from a journalist, I used to be a reporter for the Christian Science Monitor, into a novelist, I had to come to terms with what's the difference of being a journalist and a novelist. And, finally, I saw it, and then I had to learn how to execute it. And it really is that the journalist is standing outside, reporting on the world, objectively if they can, but the outside, you're reporting from the outside, and the novelist is really writing from the inside. And as you know, the really good novels are from the inside. You care about the characters, and because you care about the characters, you begin to care and learn about the environment they're living in. And in this novel, the family is a very important story, and the themes are reflected. The counter the terrorism, the criminality, as the family comes to terms with elements of the characters themselves. I hope that helps answer your question.
No, it does, and which brings me. I mean, there's a commonality to the 3 novels that I read before our meeting today, and which is, of course, love, humanity, women at the center, conflict, high finance, international crime, espionage, and so on. So what draws you to these stories? Is it the fact that you lived in different parts of the world, or is it the fact that this is a kind of universe we live in, and therefore it becomes important for you to relate to it, and is fiction the best way for you to enter that space?
I think that's right. I think when I was a journalist, among the issues I covered was the anti-war movement for Vietnam. So you had the war out there, and you had the people on the street here, and I was covering, the facts of that movement. I covered incredibly, it ages me, but I did a story on the impact in Europe of Nixon's wage price controls. So I had a broad brush, and it was interesting. But at a certain point, I really was more interested in the people, and I wanted to understand them. And as I wrote I'll tell a very short anecdote. I was about to get married, and I was working under an editor that was giving not very inspired assignments at the time. So I got him, I said, can I take $20, put it in my pocket, go to New York, and then bus into Boston? It was the end of sort of the hippie era, and just see what happens to me for, a week on the streets. And it's unusual, but he said yes. So I did that, and I spent one night in a doorway sleeping, one night at a drug rehab center, one night meeting Hell's Angels, one night with witches. I panhandled on the street. I used the money I panhandled and took a room at the Y and wrote my wedding vows. Didn't take a bath the whole time, so after 5 days I show up, and my husband is at the Fletcher School, I show up in this poncho, just a mess, to say, okay, I'm done now. Anyway, I wrote up this story. It was about 2,000 words. I gave it to the editor, the main editor, and he said, this is great, but we can't publish it. I said, well, it's like Joan Didion, who was sort of my idol, and it's like Joan Didion. I love Joan Didion. We can't publish her either. And I said, oh, And I just realized I had hit my horizon because I wanted to do other kinds of writing. And so I took a leave of absence from the Monitor. I went back to, I had a graduate degree, but I went to Brown to start my first novel. And then after a year or two, I said, I'm not coming back. And they said, no, we'll give you another year. They ended up giving me 4 years leaves of absence. And I finally said, I'm not coming back. I still wrote op-eds and I wrote stories along the way, but what I wanted to know and learn as a writer was something else. But it took a while. It took me really learning how to get the journalist off my shoulder to write fiction. But there's enough of a journalist in me that I realize in every book somewhere, not necessarily as a main character, is a journalist, checking out the world, making sure the facts are right, and I always have this yellow pad that says facts to check. But I say, okay, go away, journal. I'm going to check these facts sometime, but let my imagination take over. So there's a balancing act in that. But the issues of the world have always interested me. But the issues of the heart have interested me more.
Absolutely, and that's very clear. Before I now have some questions about going deeper into the past, but do you want to read something first? Yeah, let's do that. Yeah.
I'll read about four pages from the opening, because many people haven't read the book, and sometimes it gets abstracted. You're hearing a book you haven't even heard. Okay. This is chapter 1, which is set in July of 2007. A Moorish king and queen bob momentarily above Samantha Waters' scrambled eggs as if waiting to be fed. Outside the second-floor windows of the Hostal de Reyes Católicos, 12-foot puppets of kings and queens and devils and saints peered into the dining room and lurched away towards the square. Samantha leaned over the balustrade and filmed the festivities on the plaza below. "Let's go, Monte," she urged her sister, who was hunched over a wooden table with a plate of pancakes. "We can get coffee on the plaza." Outside, the smell of coffee and fresh almond cakes rose from the push carts as pilgrims hurried past, shaking tambourines, beating drums, and filling the morning air with sound. Somewhere, bagpipes played. The sun was already baking the cobblestones in the square where tables and chairs had been set up. "It's too crowded," Monte complained as they merged with a stream of dancers and musicians. "This is a security nightmare." "It's a festival." Samantha spotted an empty table and tossed her black straw hat over the heads of the other spectators to claim it. They'd arrived late last night, she from London and Monte from the U.S. Embassy in Cairo. At breakfast, they'd read the guidebook, which explained how a monk in the 9th century had discovered the body of the apostle in a vault in the king and queen's home village. The village had been celebrating its destiny ever since. "Remind me why we came here," Monte blinked into the sun. "We're not Catholic. Are you doing a story?" "We used to live in Spain. I thought it would be fun to come back." "We lived in Madrid, not Galicia, 30 years ago," Monte said. "You're doing a story. You're always doing a story." A correspondent for the International News Network, INN, Samantha conceded the point. "But not today. I'm hoping Cal will get here too." Their older brother was flying in from Washington en route to a magazine assignment in Turkey. "It's beautiful here and filled with history," Samantha said. "Everywhere in Europe is filled with history. Cairo is filled with even more history." Monty pulled off her khaki jacket, rolled up her shirt sleeves, and unbuttoned the waistband of her slacks, which was pinching her. "I wanted to see you before you disappeared on your next assignment," Samantha said. She watched her sister, who seemed more irritable than usual. Monty's pixie-like features were still young, but she put on weight, and her pale brown hair flared into gray arrows at her temples. Monty was 37, married with 2 children. Samantha, still single, was almost 40, but looked like the younger sister. Samantha waved for the waiter threading among the tables. "I also wanted to cheer Cal up before the divorce, though none of us knows how to take a vacation." Monty pointed to the massive Baroque and Romanesque cathedral across the square, its 10 twin towers rising over 200 feet like giant dripping sandcastles framing the facade. "How do they know it's the real body of the apostle in there?" she asked. Samantha read from the guidebook. "A hermit saw lights and heard music in the woods and found the body. Ever since, Santiago de Compostela has been the destination for pilgrims on their journeys of faith." "Faith in what?" Monty asked. "Even you don't have faith in 2,000-year-old bones." "No, but I have faith in festivals." Samantha smiled an easy smile. Monte frowned. People want to believe in something larger than themselves, Monte. Maybe, but that doesn't mean something exists. Monte fanned herself with a folded newspaper as the sun rose over the cathedral spire. She slid out of her heavy leather sandals and set her feet on top of them. She glanced up at the sound of a helicopter circling above. Around them, tourists in shorts and t-shirts weaved among the supersized puppets with wood-framed costumes balanced on the pilgrims' shoulders. The crowd looked like a gathering of medieval giants and midgets. A 12-foot devil in a smiling white mask strode past a troupe of musicians and sat a few tables away. Suddenly, the street exploded with more tambourines and drums and horns and laughter from people dressed in 15th century tunics. From the backpack at her feet, Samantha extracted her small video camera and began to film. So you are doing a story, Monte said. Just taking footage. Samantha planned to stay after the festival to research a story on drug and diamond smuggling along the Camino de Santiago, but she didn't want to tell Monte and disrupt their vacation. I'm feeling pressure at work, she said. Younger reporters are shadowing me, and the network is getting new management that doesn't care what I've done in the past. She set down her camera, but this weekend I'm not working. I want to have time together. I want to hear about your new post. Do you even speak Indonesian? I'm studying, though frankly I'd rather be studying ancient Greek. Samantha laughed. You did that in college, didn't you? She remembered her father's objection and bewilderment when Monte went off to Harvard and majored in ancient languages. You planning to liberate the Parthenon? Monte smiled for the first time, her small mouth revealing a slightly crooked front tooth. Someday, I imagine myself sitting in a hut somewhere in old age, reading the wisdom of antiquity in the original, with the ocean lapping outside my door. Samantha stretched her long legs into the plaza and pulled them back when a pilgrim tripped over her sandaled foot. I can't imagine anything beyond next Wednesday. What happens next Wednesday? That depends on what happens Tuesday. Don't you ever get tired of the pace? Monte fished an ice cube from her drink and rubbed it along her neck, which was starting to turn pink. Samantha took off her straw hat and handed it to Monte. She pulled her hair up into a ponytail off her neck. Yes, but I don't know how to stop right now. Though someday, I'd like to have a child and a family. Now Monte laughed as she put on Samantha's big brimmed hat, which fit Samantha but dwarfed her. That would slow you down. You have a father in mind I should know about? Any relationship over a few months? Samantha's blue-green eyes momentarily lost focus, and she frowned. That's unkind. No one since Evan. She looked back at the square. I'm sorry, I forgot. You never talk about him. Because you're full of judgment, Samantha wanted to say, but she didn't. She just didn't talk about her partner who'd been killed last year filming in the hills of Afghanistan. Thank you for bringing us together, Monte amended and raised her glass in a toast. They sat watching the square in silence as a band with drums and tambourines started playing. 2 tables away, a man from the hotel with unruly gray hair sat down and tipped his cap to them. Samantha nodded. Monte didn't acknowledge him, but Samantha thought she saw him. Across the square, a devil put on a white mask and weaved towards them. Anyway, something happens.
Yes, a lot of things happen, absolutely. Absolutely, thank you for that. Take us back, I mean, I was looking at your website and you talk about this beautiful early recollection of going to what was then the most important airport, Love Field Airport. And you're there with your mum and seeing the planes leave, and that takes you on a different world. Tell us what follows.
Well, I did. I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and Love Field was the big airport and often a destination for dates or anything. It was before security, and you could go and have dinner there, and you could go to the flight deck. And my mom, who had traveled very little in her life, would take my sister and I there, and we'd stand on the flight deck and watch the planes take off, especially in the dark, and she would say, where do you think that one's going? And half of them we thought were going to New York. And her advice to me was, whenever you have a chance, go. Just go see the world. Well, I really took her at her word. She said, if somebody asks you, just go. My sister did not. I don't think she got a passport till she was 40, but by then I'd had like a third passport. And so I really credit the willingness and the ability to know that the world was larger than where I lived. And when I lived in Dallas, I tended to be in political debate with, I was a newspaper editor, so that came early. But I tended to be arguing civil rights and women's rights at a young age. And I just didn't want to spend my life arguing with people around me. And I still wanted to have family I loved and not be arguing. So I was able to go off and, life led where it was. And then I got married to somebody who also knew the world was larger. And so I had that opportunity. And if I lived for 6 years in England, and as anybody who's lived in Europe knows, once you're in Europe, I mean, you can be in 20 countries in an hour and a half. So that was a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, I want to ask a question about your writing process, because one of the things you also said in the same short essay is that in a novel, the narrator and the writer must go the full distance of 300 to 400 pages, and you're interested in finding the human face and the heart in often rather extraordinary happenings. It is a gift to keep a plot engrossing and yet reflecting on the characters to reveal their vulnerabilities, and you do that very well. How do you inhabit the mind of the character to make them more granular? Because, in a way, you're writing about diplomats, you're writing about armed smugglers and journalists, but yet you're able to portray them in a way that takes them out of the second dimension and makes them third dimensional. So how do you get there?
I think with a lot of drafts. Some characters come very easily. Partly, I think, because I was a journalist, dialogue comes very easily to me. I mean, I remember the novelist I worked with, Brown, said, you could go straight to stage. All you're doing is writing dialogue. So I had to learn to write more than dialogue. So some characters I have easy access to. Some are more challenging. But ultimately, to make them work, you have to somewhere see their humanity. And then when you do, this wonderful process happens where they begin telling you their story. I mean, and many writers will tell you that, many novelists will tell you that. You think it's going this way, and they say, I'm not going that way, I'm going this way. And a story I like to tell is that a novel that hasn't been published yet, but hopefully soon will be. There was a major scene and somebody was behind the door. And I love to finish my writing day if I can, sort of on a little teeny cliffhanger of my own, so that I have to pick it up. And I knew it was one of two characters, and I go to pick it up to write, and it was another character. And I go, oh my God, of course it's that person. Because what's happening is, there's another kind of consciousness that's at work when you're writing. It's not just your conscious mind. I think there's mind with a capital M. And a good part of writing is listening. And I will not be the first novelist that will tell you that. You've probably heard that from others. It's really listening, and it's listening to your characters as well. It's not a mystical experience. It's just that their points. And recently, a novelist asked me, she said, I have this part of the book, 100 pages, and I know the ending. I don't know how to get through it. What should I do? And students used to ask me that, and my advice usually worked. I would say, go to what you've already written, because very likely what you need to know is already there. You've already written it, you just don't know. For instance, in this opening 4 pages, which I wrote early, and I didn't know where it was all going, I can now look and see 2 of the major themes of the book are set out. So when you read the book and you come to the end, you can go back and say, which were those 2 things? But 2 major scenes are set out there. And as I was writing the book, I could see the seeds that were already planted. And one thing I love in novels is when I'm surprised. And the novelist that I think is, of course, wonderful is Tolstoy. And Tolstoy will surprise you, and then you'll go, oh, of course, because you didn't see these parts being set up. And when you're writing, it's the same thing. You've often planted seeds, many of which you're aware of, but some of which you may not even be aware of. But they're there. The characters do tend to live.
So in my early years as a foreign correspondent, and most of the time was in Southeast Asia, I remember a diplomat telling me that diplomats and journalists do the same thing. They observe, they listen, as you said, and note things down. The diplomat is paid to keep quiet, and the journalist is paid to reveal it. That's the key difference between the two. Now your characters, I mean the central, Monte and Samantha who you mentioned, one is a diplomat and one is a journalist in this case. We also have a brother, but we don't see as much of him as we see of the 2 sisters in the novel. one of whom is a diplomat here, and the other ends up being a participant, and the other is a journalist, but who must learn to become discreet. To what extent do you see the diplomat and journalist as complementary or contradictory to one another?
And I would add a third. I think the spies go
Yes.
along with that, because their role is to observe, be quiet, be in the corner, but observe and have a sense of human nature and character. And there are many similar characteristics of those. The thing about a journalist, and I love them, God bless them. Most of my friends are. But as I tell people, don't trust them. Don't, if you have something that's really important and they want your story, be really sure you want that story out there with everybody, because that's their role. And I mean, I've been that, I've gotten people to trust me and tell me things they didn't necessarily want to be known. But they knew I was going to write about it, but they didn't realize what that meant. So, the journalist is there.
There's a beginning in Journalist and Murderer by Janet Malcolm, right? About, how the journalist always deceives, and you should never take the journalist
Yeah,
seriously.
don't. You can have your friends, but don't give them your story.
Yeah.
And there's several times I've had some very good top journalists of my friends, and I just didn't share everything with them, because I knew they were going to really be in a balancing act. Well, that's a really good story or not. But that's part of the job, is to get the story. And the diplomat is to find peace among all these players, and the novelist gets to just write about it. And then also,
And
I mean,
the
it's
novelist
fiction.
can make stuff up
I know,
that the
and
journalist
it's
cannot.
fiction,
Yeah.
it's fiction. One of the ways I write, people ask my writing modality, and I really often go out to restaurants to write. Somebody once asked me, what is your best writing environment? And my answer was, in the middle of a newsroom where everybody will leave me alone to write fiction. Because I love the buzz of life around me, and I can block out everybody and really concentrate. But in Washington, when you go out to restaurants and you're writing, people's lives come apart and go together, and secrets are told at restaurants. And it's amazing to me, some of the things I've heard, sitting literally, 6 feet away, and I'm working, and for some reason they don't think I can hear them. And I've heard some diplomats and others having conversations they shouldn't be having in a public place. And what I'll do is I'll flip my page over and I'll start taking elaborate notes. I would never reveal the conversation per se, but I have the notes, because I have the dynamics of the conversation and what's happening. And it also lets me just be in touch with life, not be totally, isolated. When COVID happened, I had to change my whole mode of writing, because I couldn't go out to restaurants. So I learned to write in my home. But
Yeah, there is a scene of two diplomats having a conversation with a journalist, but they are very discreet. I mean, they are very well behaved, I must say that. Yes, in a novel.
Journalists do have rules. If you say it's on background, it's on deep background. They really, a journalist will respect that.
Yeah. Absolutely. Now, I want to segue into your other life, the pen life, which we will come to now, because both Samantha and Monte quote danger. They take decisions that place themselves at risk, and their decisions impact the lives of others too. One editor used to tell me that no story is worth your life. And I mean, this was when Suharto's government was falling apart, and I was in Indonesia covering that story for Far Eastern Economic Review, which was a magazine run by the Wall Street Journal group, now sadly closed down. And yet from the time of Danny Pearl on one hand and James Foley on the other, in the past, and the state capture of Ivan Gershkovich, as we know, the murders of Daphne Caruana Galizia and Gauri Lankesh in India, and the deaths of Marie Colvin and Victoria Melina. We have story upon story of the risks that reporters take. Sometimes we know of the many reporters who have died reporting the conflict in Gaza. In some instances, the journalists die because they are at the wrong place at the time when things happen, and in some instances they are targeted. You chaired the Writers in Prison Committee. You know the risks that writers and journalists take, and you continue to take an interest in seeking freedom for writers. Danny Pearl was, I think, 2000 or 2001, I think. Yeah, 2001. That's been 20-something years. Is the situation much worse now? Is a pact between the terrorist and the journalist, which was that I'm here with my pencil and notepad, I'm here just to write your story. You tell me the story, I will give it an airing, but that's it. Has that pact ended?
I think, I have a couple of very close friends I began my career with, and one of them's really quite celebrated, and they still, I mean, this one woman is, she's 5 years older than I am, and she still goes to the Ukraine. She goes to, and I say, oh, please be safe. They know what they're doing, but you can't, you just don't have control of your environment. But they're dedicated to know the story and to get it out there, and that's why they're good, and they know the rules, and they're still around, so they know them. But I don't think it's safe. But if you don't, the challenge, what has changed is the access we have to these kinds of stories, because the media has changed. We don't have all the papers and all the foreign correspondence that we used to have. We certainly don't have the Washington bureaus we used to have from every major metropolis and state. The media has changed a lot. So there are far fewer original journalists out there getting original work. There's an awful lot of secondary journalism. They go to the main reporters that are on maybe the New York Times or the Post, and then they report it on the cable news, and by the time you get your New York Times and Post, you've already heard it, but they haven't been reporting it. It's these journalists on front lines that have been reporting it. So journalism has changed. But the intrepid reporter still's out there, hopefully wise, some less wise. In this story, in The Far Side of the Desert, some of the courage that Samantha demonstrates isn't so much as being a journalist as just determined to find, I'm revealing who got kidnapped. Anyway, the sister.
She's being a good sister. She's being a good sister.
She's being a good sister. And there's one place in the end where it is very dangerous for her to go, and she says, I know my sister, and there's an event, and only she as a sister could know.
Yeah.
And but it's a balancing act.
Yeah. Two more questions before we turn to the audience. One is, you also wrote this work of nonfiction to which I wanted to turn to, which is The Pen Journeys, which is a reflective, meditative account of your journey with pen and the struggles for free speech. Can you talk about its continued relevance, and then let's go to the Santiago story after that? Yeah.
Okay. Well, Pen International turned 100 years old in 2021, and for those of you that don't know Penn as well, Penn has 150 centers in over 100 countries. These are all writers. And nobody wanted or could write the centenary document for Penn. Nobody would write the history. I mean, we just couldn't, Penn couldn't find a writer to do it. So the president of Penn, I was at the time, a long time ago, I had been persuaded to write a blog. He said, you have to have a website, you need to blog. The person said, I don't know what a blog is. And they said, you got to blog. So once a month, at least, I would write a blog. And I had started having fun with it. And so the president of Penn said, Joanne, can you just write? So I said, okay, I blog once a month, I can write one episode of a memory, which began for me, which was the next question, with Rushdie and the fatwa, because I had been engaged there. And I started writing 1 or 2 blogs a month up to the centenary. And I'd been involved for 30 years, and I'd been the international secretary. And so that way, 2,000-word essays, one on top of the other, began to build at least some kind of history. Because there was really very little written history. You change regimes and nobody knew what had happened. So, and I also am a bit of a pack rat, so I hadn't thrown papers away, I just threw them in drawers. So I had all these, I still have these boxes and boxes of Penn documents. And Penn's archives are at the University of Texas at the Ransom Center, and they know I have them, and they're going there. So they're getting organized to be sent there. But so I put together these journeys, which are about 45 of them, I think, and a publisher in Britain had published them. So it's called Pen Journeys, Memoir of Literature on the Line. So,
now take us to the story that we're waiting for. Yes.
that you're waiting for. Well, people ask me where this book began, and in the early 90s, International Pen used to have annual congresses where everybody from around the world came together. And that year it was in Santiago de Compostela. And I was elected the chair of the Writers in Prison Committee, which is the position that oversees the human rights work of Penn internationally. And we had a surprise visitor. And it's the only time you've ever had to go through a metal detector to get to a Penn Congress. And this person was supposed to, person was certified very secretly. It was the first time this person had been out and about because there was a lot of security around him. And when he arrived, there were people all over the plaza and watching and cheering because Jose Iglesias arrived at the same time. So it's no security. And it was Salman Rushdie. And because of the position I had, I was invited to a small dinner with Rushdie. I remember I sat next to him and shared a dessert. I'm sure he doesn't remember that. But I began thinking, what would it be like to be completely taken out of your life? All the things you thought you were and had. And I just began thinking about that idea. And I was in this place with this amazing scene with because the Festival of St. James just happened to be going on at the same time as the Congress. So I just began writing what I thought would be a short story. And that's the seed of the idea. And then it grew. It took off and grew from there. And it didn't take off in a linear fashion. One of the early next scenes was the one chapter in Georgetown. And I didn't quite know how these pieces would go together, but draft after draft after draft they did.
They do cohere very well, and it's a yarn, it's a great yarn, and I recommend it strongly. But questions, comments, thoughts? I know probably not many of you have had the chance to read the book, but at least you have a flavor of it now. So if there are any questions, let's have them now. Otherwise, we can have the autographing. Yeah. Yes, please.
This is the second of, I think, 3 books you've said, Joanne, that are being published about the same time with similar themes. How do the 3 come together, and how did you decide the order of releasing?
I didn't decide anything. The publisher's taken 2 of them. I don't know who and when the third one will come out, but I didn't write them in order. But there are 3 novels. My next one, there is another novel that's called Washington Days, Beirut Nights, that has some similar context. It's a different story, different characters. But these have interested me, and I've been interested in many areas of the world, but particularly in the Middle East. In writing Burning Distance, I took Arabic lessons for a long time, just so I would just get familiar with the language, and also when I would go to the Middle East, I could say a few words, and then people thought I spoke Arabic and rattled off to me, and I didn't know what they were saying. But I could say "Ana atakelam kalil Arabi," which is I only speak a little Arabic. But it was an interest, and when I went in these regions, I was often with organizations. So I would go I was on the board of the International Crisis Group. You know that for 20 years, and I would be in the region with him, or I was with PEN, and I would be in Lebanon or Jordan with PEN, or Save the Children. And I had the privilege of working with a lot of very good Human Rights Watch non-profits who did work in the regions, and I would go, and that's how I began seeing places, and I would take notes, and in my head stories were going on at the same time. But the publisher made the judgment of what came out when. Anybody else? Yes.
I'd like to ask authors if the book was optioned for film.
Yes.
Who would use cast as the characters in the book?
Well, that's an interesting question.
This is a very filmable novel, I can tell you that, yeah.
I've thought about that, and I was thinking about that the other day, and I can't remember who I came up with. But the interesting thing is, because these books have been so long before they've been published, who I used to think about are no longer appropriate. There'd be the grandmothers or the mothers or something for them. There used to be a young actress who was the wife of somebody I knew, and I thought she'd be perfect for one of them. And, I don't know where she is now, but it'd be fun to think about. And there is one actor that has contacted me. It's very slippery. I lived in LA for 11 years, so I'm very aware of what a slippery slope that is and spider webs that is. But you never know. We'll see if that takes another step forward. Anybody else? Well, thank you all for coming very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
It was a pleasure.